Some crimes the world obsesses over, cases that are talked about for decades. But some cases just stop. No updates, no explanations, just silence. And when that silence comes from an agency like the FBI, the ones that are supposed to have answers, it raises a different kind of question. Not what happened, but why aren't they talking? Because in each of these cases, something went wrong, something that was never fully explained, and maybe they want to keep it that way. It was a quiet evening in Borrego Park. Blaze and his new friend Sam were meeting up to hang out before heading back to college after winter break. But the thing was, none of Sam's other friends really knew who this Sam guy was. Sam described Blaze as a friend, but Blaze had never mentioned his name before. Worse yet, Blaze hadn't even mentioned wanting to meet up with anyone that night. So what was really going on? Well, when Blaze's parents woke up the next day to find him missing, they were worried. And soon enough, they learned that this quiet night in the park would be Blaze's last. Blaze Bernstein was born in Orange County, California, to parents Gene and Gideon. He had two brothers, Jay and Bo. Blaze was known for being a quirky, all smiles, always happy and passionate about a lot of things kind of guy. More than anything, though, he loved music, writing, and cooking. Blaze belonged to a Jewish family, and around the time of this case, he was going through some pretty serious changes in his life. Considering he was only 19 years old, he was still learning a lot about himself. And being in your mid to late teen years, well, it's hard on just about everyone. But overall, everything was going great for him. He attended the Orange County School of the Arts, and after that, he enrolled in the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Even though Blaze was in love with food and creative writing, he wanted to pursue a degree in medicine, which was exactly what he chose. He was a super smart guy, and everyone in his family believed that medicine would be an amazing career for him. Blaze was in his sophomore year at the time of the case, and by all accounts, he was living his best life, doing the things he loved beside the people he loved. It was the summer of 2017 when this case really began to unfold. It was winter break, and the holidays were coming up, so Blaze was headed home from Philly to California to see his family. He caught up on family updates, spent a lot of time in the kitchen whipping up food for his friends and family, and he was having a great time. Blaze was incredibly excited about spending a week or so with his family before heading back to school, and it was a picture-perfect holiday. Everyone from Blaze's immediate family was there to share stories and laughs, but before Blaze knew it, it was time to head back to school and begin the next semester. The day Blaze left his parents' home to head back to the daily grind was January 2nd, 2018, just a day after ringing in the new year. But for Blaze, this day would hold particular importance because it was the last day he was seen alive. Blaze's parents didn't immediately realize that their son was even missing. He was at home in a place where he grew up, and they noticed that he'd left their house and seemed to have been gone for quite some time. But his parents didn't seem too worried. Maybe he was just out meeting some old friends. But the next morning, Jean was at a dentist's appointment, and that was when she was hit with a very uncomfortable and nagging thought. Blaze hadn't reached out since last night. In fact, Blaze promised to join his mom at that appointment, but he didn't show up. This wasn't normal for Blaze at all. He wouldn't just bail on his parents. If he was busy, then he would have called to let them know so that they wouldn't wait on him. Gideon and Jean constantly called Blaze, but there was no answer. The two immediately got home and went to his room, and he wasn't there either. But his belongings were, including his wallet, retainer, and glasses. Jean knew that if Blaze went anywhere, he would always put his retainers in and take his wallet with him. So all this was in the house, but where was Blaine? His friends were called, but no one had heard from him. It was like he had disappeared in the dark of night, leaving his family worried to the core. The Bernstein family soon called the police and reported 19-year-old Blaze missing, while family and friends tried to find any clues, answers, and information about Blaze. So they did what came to their mind. They logged into Blaze's computer, and they were somehow able to access Blaze's Snapchat. Nothing was unusual, save for one thing, and this would be the only lead in the case. Blaze had sent a message to someone. It was a young man named Sam, and Blaze had sent him his home address. Now, this name was not familiar to the Bernstein family. They didn't know this mysterious guy named Sam, but it seemed like he was the last person to be with Blaze, or at the least, he may have known something about him. So Blaze's parents wasted no time and contacted Sam Woodward. They also recorded the conversation and handed it over to investigators later on. Gideon was the one who talked to Sam, who said that he picked Blaze up from his house at 11 p.m. on the night of January 2nd, and the two drove to Borrego Park in Lake Forest. There, Blaze got out of the car and told Sam that he was going to meet another friend and proceeded to walk down a dimly lit path and then disappeared. Sam tried calling after Blaze, but he didn't see or hear anything. Blaze, out of nowhere, just left Sam in the park. Now, this was really bizarre. Something about Sam's story was not sitting right with the Bernstein family. It also didn't help that they didn't know who Sam was, so they asked him how he knew Blaze, to which Sam answered that the two were friends in Orange County School of Arts. So the detectives decided to talk to old friends and classmates of Blaze's, and the search for answers led them to Rhea, Blaze's best friend of many years. Rhea, Blaze, and Sam were all classmates at the Orange County School of Arts, and contrary to Sam's version of events, the investigators found out from Rhea that Sam and Blaze weren't exactly friends. Rhea explained that Sam was an outcast of the classroom. He was quiet, alone, dismissive, and, quote, crazy. He and Blaze were worlds apart. Blaze was warm, happy, and friendly with everyone, and Sam couldn't have been more different. Rhea and other classmates remembered Sam being really weird. He was fond of drawing, but his drawings weren't cartoon characters or squiggly lines. Sam drew firearms all over his notebook pages. He was super conservative, and many people rejected his opinions on race and equality, but the point is, he was the odd man out. Everyone who knew Blaze and Sam were certain that the two couldn't be friends. They barely interacted in OCSA, and their mutual friends didn't even know each other. So why did Sam meet up with Blaze? And why was it so out of the blue? When you combine this with Sam's odd story about Blaze going with him to the park, then just wandering off without warning, well, things were getting stranger very quickly. Even though Sam at this point hadn't seemingly done anything wrong, police were highly suspicious of him. And with that, Sam was listed as the prime suspect in Blaze's disappearance. 3 days into Blaze's inexplicable disappearance, the search was on. The police were searching all the wooded areas, remote places, and neighboring areas of the park where Blaze was last seen. Drones were flying over the thick tree-covered areas, and missing person posters being printed by the thousands and stuck everywhere. The community came together in search for Blaze, and to support the worried and fearful Bernstein family in this very challenging time. The investigators also talked to Sam, and he maintained that he didn't know what happened to Blaze after he vanished. He basically repeated the same story he told Blaze's parents. The detectives conducted searches in the pouring rain, and they were laser focused on one particular area in Borrego Park. Now, it was raining, but the visibility was as clear as it could be. But the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to find something. And they did 8 long days later. On January 10th, 2018, a police officer noticed something under a tree in Borrego Park. It was a large tree branch that looked seemingly normal, but under it was disturbed, dug up dirt. The investigators dug and dug, and not even a few feet in, they found a human body, deceased, cold, and covered in slash wounds. It was 19-year-old Blaze Bernstein, only this time he was not sporting his signature smile and squinted eyes. His face and body were cold, expressionless, and lifeless. Blaze was found deceased in a shallow grave in the same park where he was last seen with his friend. Right by his body was a broken cell phone, and it belonged to Blaze too. The police, the community, and Blaze's parents were shocked and in disbelief. They were praying and hoping for Blaze's safe return, but unfortunately that day would never come. An autopsy was conducted, and the results were absolutely gut-wrenching. Blaze was attacked with a knife almost 28 times. The coroner, even just looking at Blaze's injuries and the number of times he'd been slashed, knew that the attack was fueled by hatred and anger. This begged the question, what did 19-year-old Blaze do to be attacked so viciously? Well, the detectives knew where to find all of these answers, and it was from Sam Woodward. Sam was arrested 2 days after Blaze's body was found in Borrego Park, and as they questioned and looked into Sam, they found even more disturbing details about him. 20-year-old Samuel Woodward, better known as Sam, was from Newport Beach, California. He enrolled in the Orange County School of Arts, but he had to be pulled out since he was extremely aggressive towards certain young men at the school. Specifically, the guy was super homophobic and very open about it. Well, while Sam was in custody and not saying anything about what happened at Borrego Park, the investigators had no choice but to do some digging for themselves. The police opened up Sam's life and turned it inside out, and what they found truly sent chills down their spines. Sam had a very dark secret, and the investigators firmly believed that this secret had everything to do with what he did to Blaze. Sam was actually a member of a cult. He was part of a far-right extremist group that promoted hate speech, violence, and aggression towards anyone they didn't agree with. The cult was formed in 2013, and it was based in the southern United States before spreading its menacing claws like a disease over to the UK, then to Canada, Germany, and even some parts of Europe. The cult was described as one of the most violent movements of the 21st century. This group basically wants to take over the world, annihilate everyone and everything, and start something new. It's a new world order sort of thing, and they want everyone on the planet to believe in their twisted, hateful ways. Their main targets are Jewish people, as well as members of the LGBT community. The detectives found out that since Sam was an outcast, his only outlet of expression was the internet, and that was when he stumbled across the cult. And there he found like-minded people who were just as evil and cynical as he was. I know everyone has to find their people or their tribe or whatever, but Sam took this to another level. Sam attended these events called hate camps, in which members of the cult are essentially trained to become violent and aggressive, and are basically mentored by people to become peace disruptors. To the cult, whenever someone attacked or took the life of a person or a minority, different ethnicity, or even sexuality, it was a good day to be alive. And devastatingly, when Sam's fellow members found out that he took Blaze's life, they celebrated it like Christmas. This is because Blaze had recently come out as gay, and he was also an active member of the Jewish community, so in essence, he was a perfect target. Once police learned these things about Blaze, they knew Sam was responsible. But here's the kicker, a plot twist, if you will. When investigators went through Sam's phone and belongings, they found something that truly took them by surprise. Sam was struggling with his own sexuality too. The investigators found evidence of Sam visiting gay dating websites and even watching heaps of gay adult content. This was the same content that cult was repulsed by. Investigators also found messages between Sam and Blaze, and Sam's tone was very flirtatious. This added another new layer to Blaze's case. It seemed that Sam was not very accepting of his own sexuality, and Blaze being so open, honest, and living his best life while being someone who finds men attractive could be the root of jealousy and resentment in Sam's mind. Sam couldn't be openly gay because he was in this cult. He would literally get killed by the group if he was found out to find men attractive. The police believed that Sam tried very hard to suppress his desires and sexuality, but seeing the stark contrast of Blaze's life made him feel miserable and angry. The only thing about this whole situation that doesn't make any sense to me is, if Sam was really gay all along, why did he join the cult in the first place? An easy argument to be made is, oh, he just wanted somewhere he could fit in. But Sam didn't fit in, not even a little bit. The only thing he had in common with these people was that he was an angry, bitter man. Now, I can imagine coming face to face with your own sexuality. It's terrifying. But nothing about this makes any sense. It seemed like Sam had dug his own grave by joining the cult and suppressing his sexuality, and all of that pent-up aggression, frustration, and rage finally came out, and Blaze was forced to pay for it. An innocent bystander who wouldn't hurt a fly. Sam was eventually charged with murder, use of a deadly weapon, and 2 charges of hate crimes. He pleaded not guilty to all of the charges, even though DNA evidence in Sam's car and home showed that he was the one who ended Blaze's life. Sam's car, as well as the knife used on Blaze, which was found in Sam's home, also had Blaze's DNA all over it. The main challenge for the prosecution was not to prove whether Sam murdered Blaze or not, he most definitely did. It was to prove whether it was a hate crime or not. The motive was pertinent in this trial. Sam's defense went for voluntary manslaughter charges, which, if all worked out, would see Sam eventually paroled. The prosecution, on the other hand, was adamant that the crime was cold, calculated, deliberate, and fueled by hatred, and they were looking at a life in prison sentence with no parole. Well, the road to justice was going to be long, because during all of this, COVID-19 happened, and the trial was postponed time and time again. The Bernstein family was exhausted by the constant back and forth, and they just wanted justice to be served. They didn't want to wait and live in the grief and hurt of what had happened to their son. They wanted the murderer to be punished and for this nightmare to end. But by the time Sam was taken to trial, it was April of 2024. The Bernstein family had to spend 6 long, grueling years to finally take their son's case to trial and punish the wrongdoer. Well, 6 years after the murder of Blaze, a lot of things have changed. And I'm not just talking about the new restrictions and the new normal. Sam looked completely different. His hair was super long and messy all the way down to his shoulders. His nails were overgrown and he was very quiet and reserved. Some people thought that Sam looked eerily similar to Charles Manson, who was also a narrow-minded murderer and an overall waste of space. But his reign of terror, that's for another day. But I will say this, Charles Manson was actually idolized by Sam's cult, and that alone says a lot. But soon, the trial started, and the prosecution presented all the evidence against Sam. His being in the cult, his closeted sexuality, his conflicting attraction to Blaze, and him being the last person to see Blaze alive. The prosecution's argument was based on the fact that Sam knew that he liked men too, but seeing how homosexuality was viewed and how the cult influenced him in all the wrong ways, left Sam feeling angry towards Blaze, who was not only Jewish but also openly gay. He couldn't bear to see Blaze living his life happily and not being judged by others, and this led Sam to end his life in cold blood. He had the murder weapon on him, and Sam planned everything beforehand when he lured Blaze in on the night of January 2nd. Now, the defense argued that Sam was just a misunderstood young man who had mental health issues and no real social skills. But things really took a turn when the defense brought up a pretty surprising argument. They claimed that what had happened to Blaze had brought on himself. Let me explain. Basically, the defense claimed that on the night of Blaze's murder, Sam was smoking illegal goods. Sam felt very out of it and everything was hazy, but he distinctly remembered Blaze pulling out his phone and recording Sam and trying to cop a feel. Sam was flustered and disgusted at Blaze's actions. See, Sam was raised as a conservative Catholic, so while he knew that he was attracted to men, he didn't want anyone else to find out. And Blaze recording this whole thing, well, that simply couldn't happen. I guess being in a violent, people-hating and murderous cult was acceptable for Sam, but coming to terms with his sexuality wasn't. Common sense has left the chat, but back at the car, Sam explained that Blaze apparently threatened to expose Sam and his sexuality with a compromising picture or video, whatever it was. And that was when Sam was trapped in a corner. He saw no way out, and he pulled out a retractable pocket knife, which he always kept on him since he was a Boy Scout. And he didn't stop attacking Blaze until Blaze stopped struggling. It was such an appalling moment for Blaze's family. To hear that their son was now getting blamed for what happened to him, and that somehow he was at fault, it left everyone's jaws on the floor. To be fair, no compromising photo of Sam was ever found on Blaze's phone, so we can safely say that Sam was likely making all of this up. He was lying to save his own skin. He would do anything but admit that he liked men and had conflicting feelings about who he was attracted to. But by July of 2024, everyone was waiting for the verdict. Was Sam guilty of a vicious hate crime, or was he going to get away with a manslaughter charge? Well, after the jury deliberated, the verdict was out. Sam Woodward was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Blaze Bernstein as a hate crime. 4 months later, in November of 2024, Sam was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The trial of Sam Woodward was not just a murder trial. It was the beginning of a new revolution against hate crimes for victims in the same shoes as Blaze. Blaze's parents, Gideon and Jean, decided to put all of their pain and suffering into a greater cause, and they founded Blaze It Forward, a kindness movement, which is a safe space for people of all sexualities and for spreading positivity. Borrego Park, the haunting place where Blaze's life was put to an end, has also now become a memorial of sorts. Hundreds upon hundreds of colorful stones with heartwarming and comforting words for Blaze and his family decorate the area where Blaze's body was found. The Bernstein family is so grateful for the support that they got from practical strangers during these long and hurtful years. And they're at peace that Blaze is remembered exactly the way he's supposed to be, for his warmth and for his smile. His life may have been cut short, but his parents have ensured that his impact and his love will continue to live on long after he's gone, in color, brightness, and warmth. The Bernstein family believes that no one should be punished or judged for who they love. Moving on seems very easy, and sometimes Blaze's parents can get by with his memories, but there's still a long way to heal for him. I feel like it's obvious that just because you disagree with someone, it doesn't give you the right to resort to murder. Having disagreements about lifestyles, values, whatever it may be, that's part of life. This sort of conflict has quite literally been around since the dawn of man. Thousands of years, people have been arguing about what lifestyle is the best. But the truth is, the best lifestyle is one of mutual respect. I don't have to agree with what you're doing, what you're saying, or how you're living. It's your life, it's not mine. Now, I should have every right to make my opinions known, and you yours. But neither opinion has the weight or the right to overrule how someone else wants to live their life. We're all put here to live our lives and make choices. And whether someone else's choices are right or good, that's not up to us. All we can do is focus on our own thoughts, our own actions, and where we want to be at the end of it all. Tim Woody left his teenage sister Kacie at home while he headed off to the college library to do some research. The whole while, Kacie stayed at home on her computer, chatting away with her friends on Yahoo Messenger, and time passed by in the blink of an eye. Tim got home at about 10 p.m., but as he opened the front door, he was met by eerie silence. Normally he'd hear Kacie typing or giggling in the next room over, but not this time. The silence was so heavy, you could feel it. Tim looked around the house, wondering if Kacie may have headed off to bed early, but she hadn't. And Tim quickly realized the house was completely empty. The computer was on, but Kacie was nowhere to be found. As Tim started looking around, he found Kacie's glasses tossed onto the floor, completely smashed. As if things weren't unsettling already, the family dog soon came running in. But running is an overstatement. The poor dog could hardly walk. It was limping in pain and whimpering, as if it was trying to tell Tim that something terrible had happened. But Tim already knew. But what he didn't know was where was his sister. Kacie Woody was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, to parents Rick and Christy Woody. She had two older brothers, Austin and Tim. Growing up, Kacie was defined as a kind and caring girl who loved poetry, singing, and dancing. She also loved to play the saxophone. She loved animals too, as do most people, but there was one type of animal Kacie didn't like: horses. It turned out there was a story behind her dislike of horses. In June of 1997, when Kacie was just 7 years old, her family got into a car accident. They were en route to Tim's baseball game when a bunch of horses were set loose on the road, and it caused Rick, her father, to swerve. As a result of that, they collided with an oncoming horse, and Kacie's mom, Christy, tragically lost her life right then and there. Rick also suffered from a lot of injuries, but luckily he pulled through. Ever since her mom's passing, Kacie jumped into poetry and would dedicate countless poems to her mom. The memory of this left Kacie with a serious distaste for horses, but that tragedy didn't fade her shine forever. At the time of the case, Kacie, Rick, Tim, Austin, and Tim's friend Eric all lived in a house in Holland, Arkansas, whereas Kacie's aunt, Teresa, was the Woody's family's next-door neighbor, helping take up that motherly gap that Christy had so tragically left behind. Funny enough, the Woody family lived in a heavily wooded area in Arkansas, and even though Kacie was still too young to use the internet unsupervised, her dad allowed her to use instant messaging on the family's computer. See, where they lived, outgoing calls were billed as long distance, which meant that the Woody phone bill was often incredibly expensive. This was why the family often kept in touch through instant messages to update each other. Kacie had an account on Yahoo Messenger by the name of Model Behavior 36. She would regularly chat with her family and friends on Yahoo, and she also registered on several Christian chat rooms to find friends because she thought it was safer. Somewhere between 2001 and 2002, it's assumed that Kacie stumbled across another user on Yahoo by the name of Dave Fagan. His username on Yahoo was JazzmanDF, and he was a young boy from California who loved surfing. Well, as soon as Kacie and Dave exchanged messages, they developed an online friendship. Dave seemed normal, and he and Kacie shared a lot of the same interests. Kacie eventually began to open up about her personal life, and even told Dave about her mom's passing and how it had affected her. Dave also shared a great deal of personal details, including his aunt, who lived in Arkansas, and her failing health. The two talked for a long time, for many months, and even though Dave sounded a bit too old for Kacie, saying he'd be turning 18 soon, their friendship continued to grow. Before anyone knew it, young Kacie would find herself in her first real relationship. But everything was not what it seemed. Kacie ended up introducing her best friends, Samantha and Jessica, to Dave, and they added each other to their buddy list. For any of you guys that may either be too young to have experienced Yahoo Messenger or maybe too old to have ever cared about it in the first place, Yahoo Messenger was basically the same thing as texting these days, but everything took place on a computer. The best part about the internet in the 90s and early 2000s was that when you were done, you could turn it off and walk away. But these days, it follows you wherever you go. Some people say this is progress, but I'm not personally sure. But anyway, you'd be able to compile a friends list of people where you could just click their name and immediately start up a conversation, assuming that they were at their desk. Dave made his way onto the friend list of Kacie and several of her friends. Well, Jessica and Sam, two of those friends, were pretty protective of Kacie. They tried warning her to not be so open and honest with people that she'd never seen in person before, and falling in love with them or starting a relationship should be a no-go. Samantha and Jessica were scared that someone might take advantage of Kacie's naivety. At that point, they even stressed that strangers on Yahoo could be, quote, 80-year-old grandpas wanting to lure young children into their traps. Kacie took note of this warning, but she didn't stop talking to Dave. Since Kacie's dad, Rick, worked as a police officer, he was out on shifts most of the time and wasn't home to monitor his daughter's internet activity. And even though he knew that Kacie was talking to boys on the computer, he thought that as long as Kacie was at home and the boys were elsewhere, Kacie would be safe from any sort of danger. Kacie's brothers were also in college, so they would usually be on campus attending classes. But there was still Kacie's aunt, Teresa, who lived next door, so Kacie's family was at ease knowing at least she wasn't completely alone. Well, in the summer of 2002, Rick found out that Dave was turning 18, and since Kacie was still very young, he prohibited her from talking to Dave. Kacie obviously rebelled, and somehow she and Dave started talking on the phone. Well, in the autumn of 2002, something strange happened in the Woody household. See, Kacie and her best friend Jessica were spending the night at her place when all of a sudden, the girls started hearing strange noises coming from downstairs as well as outside of the house. They heard the wooden floorboards creaking as if someone was downstairs, but no one was at home besides the girls, at least as far as they knew and hoped. Kacie and Jessica were scared to the bone and barricaded themselves in Kacie's bedroom. Kacie didn't have a landline near her to call her dad or the police, so she reached out to none other than Dave and told him that someone was in their house. Dave, in an attempt to try and calm Kacie down, told her not to worry and that no one was likely in the house. And suddenly, as if Dave's words were magic, the noises stopped completely. This event left Kacie pretty shaken up, but she didn't stop talking to Dave. And actually, Kacie would soon make another online friend right after this incident. In October of 2002, Kacie met another boy on Yahoo Messenger, and he was a 14-year-old boy named Scott. His username was Taz2999, and he was from Alpharetta, Georgia. He loved football and wrestling, and his profile picture was of a teen boy wearing a football uniform. At some point, Scott and Kacie began dating, and this turned into a very confusing situation between Kacie, Dave, and Scott. When Dave found out about Kacie dating Scott, he wasn't angry or betrayed per se. He just requested to remain friends with Kacie because he needed someone to talk to about his aunt. And since Kacie connected with him on a sympathetic and personal level, she agreed to keep in touch. But Kacie didn't heed her friend's warning about not giving personal information to online strangers, and she ended up sharing her home address with Scott. One day, Samantha and Jessica were shocked to find Scott's physical picture, the same picture he had on Yahoo, inside Kacie's locker. They confronted Kacie about this, and she admitted that she'd given her home address to Scott, and he presumably mailed her this photo. Now, I know Kacie is young, and this was back in 2002, but trusting a practical stranger online and giving him her home address was certainly a mistake on Kacie's part, and she certainly knew this, but her love for Scott was overwhelming, and so she tossed caution to the wind and convinced herself that her friends were just being overprotective. This led Samantha to reach out to the school's counselor and unfold the entire scene of Kacie interacting with strangers online and giving out her home address and phone number to these people. Kacie was immediately called into the office and given a crash course on internet safety. This led to a brief argument between Kacie and Samantha, but they eventually made up, and Kacie proceeded to invite Samantha to a sleepover soon after. Samantha actually declined because it was a weekday and she had some things to do. Kacie then asked Jessica, but she was also busy and couldn't make it. Jessica and Samantha did find it weird that Kacie was suggesting a sleepover on a school night. Their gut told them something was up, and their guts were right. On the evening of December 3rd, 2002, Kacie was home alone. Even though Kacie was usually alone since her dad and brothers were out and about, her aunt was right next door and would keep an eye on her. But this time around, Kacie's aunt, Teresa, was also out in Conway for her daughter's baseball game. So Kacie was truly all alone in her home. Computer and landline records showed that Kacie was talking to her online boyfriend, Scott, on Yahoo, whereas she was also in contact with Dave on the phone. At around 9:41 p.m., Scott noticed that Kacie had stopped replying to his messages. The chat room was open, but Kacie was not answering any of her messages. Scott really got worried, and he called the home landline, as well as contacted Kacie's friend, Jessica, via email, but to no avail. Kacie was out of nowhere just ghosting him. A while later, Kacie's brother, Tim, and his friend Eric arrived home, and while Eric assumed that Kacie had just gone to bed and didn't think much of it, Tim was immediately alert when he saw a couple of things. First, Kacie's reading glasses were damaged, and a lens was missing as if someone had smashed it. The computer was open but unattended, and the chat room with Scott was still open. And the most alarming part was the fact that the family dog, a Yorkshire Terrier, was limping and whimpering. Tim immediately called his dad, Rick, and the detectives were quickly involved once Kacie's friends didn't hear anything from her either. The detectives initially thought that Kacie was a runaway, but Rick was quick to rebuff those claims. He told them that he and Kacie had actually talked a few hours before she went missing at about 7 p.m., and Kacie was practicing her saxophone. Moreover, Kacie's clothes, thick coats and shoes were all left behind. So if Kacie wanted to run away, she would have taken at least some warm clothing with her, because at night the temperatures were ruthlessly cold. Soon, the FBI joined the missing person investigation too, and the investigators talked to everyone, Kacie's friends, schoolmates, and even teachers. They wanted to find any clues that could have explained Kacie's disappearance. That's when they got to know about Kacie's online relationships with Scott and Dave, two practical strangers. The detectives were immediately on high alert. They thought that either Scott or Dave had something to do with Kacie's disappearance. First, they were able to track down Scott through his computer activity, and sure enough, he wasn't lying. He was in Georgia, and after a lengthy crackdown, the FBI was able to confirm that Scott was indeed 14 years old, and he wasn't lying to Kacie. So he couldn't have been a threat to her, even though he knew where Kacie lived. So the next person they needed to talk to was this Dave guy, and after going through his and Kacie's chats, they found something out. Dave was actually on his way from California to Arkansas to see his ailing aunt one last time, because she wasn't going to last long. This was taking place sometime right before Kacie went missing. The investigators were highly suspicious of Dave and his sudden trip to Arkansas, and things weren't adding up. The detectives launched a search around the area where they thought Dave was staying, and they were able to pinpoint the location to a motel in Conway at a Motel 6, where a man with a 1993 Buick Regal and a California license plate had arrived a day before Kacie went missing. This man was 47-year-old David Fuller. He'd booked a week's stay in the motel and was complaining non-stop about the internet not working properly. The police then went to the Conway Enterprise rent-a-car from where David recently rented a silver Dodge Caravan minivan, and the employees remembered David being on edge. He was constantly taking smoke breaks while completing the paperwork, and he was just acting oddly. The detectives were later able to get a hold of Dave's contact number, and lo and behold, it was the same number used to contact Kacie on the landline. So the investigators were sure of one thing. There was no 18-year-old Dave Fagan. It was actually 47-year-old David Fuller, pretending to be a teenager, and he was grooming Kacie. But now, she was gone, and Dave was the prime suspect in her disappearance. David Leslie Fuller belonged to a Mormon family of 6. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, David married a woman at the age of 19 but got divorced shortly after. He then married a woman named Sally in the 80s, and sometime later, she gave birth to 2 children, a son and a daughter, 4 years apart. David started out his work life as a Navy Seabee in 1989, but he left the Navy in 1999 when the family of 4 moved to La Mesa. This was the time when David began to display anger problems and mood swings. He would also subject Sally to abuse, and at one point, Sally caught David spending long hours of the day on the internet, taking late-night walks and talking to someone on the phone. In 2002, Sally and David were considering getting a divorce, and it's safe to say that David was not happy at all. The couple eventually separated, and David just got worse from this point on. He got arrested and charged with spousal abuse when he charged into Sally's home, threatened her, and used force to subdue her, and even managed to attack Sally with a screwdriver, despite the fact that she'd barricaded herself in a bedroom of her home. After all this blew over, David ended up getting a job at a used car dealership, but instead of working, he spent his time on his work computer, watching inappropriate content involving children. It's pretty clear to see at this point, Dave had a serious problem. With all of this information, in search of Kacie, the police focused their attention on a storage unit David had rented. See, David's credit card notified the detectives that he was renting a storage unit at GuardSmart. So the investigators made a beeline for the storage unit, hoping to catch David red-handed and hopefully find Kacie alive and well. But little did they know, they were about to get a lot more than they bargained for. A day following Kacie's disappearance, on December 4th, 2002, Little Rock police arrived at the storage unit at GuardSmart at around 6 p.m. The door was closed, but it was unlocked, so the detectives pulled the rolling door up. And when they did, 2 things happened at once. First, the police saw the silver Dodge Caravan parked inside the storage unit facing the investigators, and then a second later, a single pop rang through the tense and eerie storage space. Someone had fired a round inside. The officers ran for cover and called for backup, all the while commanding whoever was inside to surrender and come out of the unit. But there was no answer or movement inside that storage unit. Still, the detectives didn't move a muscle, and they waited for SWAT teams to arrive. Finally, over 2 hours later, at around 8:30 p.m., the police and SWAT teams entered the storage unit. But what they saw before them likely haunts them to this day. On the ground, by the still running minivan, lay 47-year-old David Fuller, with a single wound to his head. Clutched in his hand was a 9mm firearm. Next, the detectives went around the minivan, and when they reached the back, they saw something. It was light and pale. They weren't sure what it was, but they soon found out in the back of the van, chained to the corners of the van floor, lay the lifeless body of Kacie Woody. David took her life with that same firearm he'd used on himself, and horrifically, David had done much more to her before her life was taken. This was far, far too much for the detectives to handle. This scene was very, very bad. Next to Kacie's head was a bottle of chloroform and a dirty rag. The investigators suspect that this was how David managed to knock Kacie out and abduct her from her home in Holland, Arkansas. Kacie had been found, but the bigger problem was her life had already been ended, and the killer wouldn't even face the consequences of his actions. Following the discovery of Kacie's body and David's irreversible actions, the FBI got a search warrant for David's apartment. And when they searched the place, it was worse than they had feared. Right by David's computer, there was a collage of Kacie's pictures and a piece of paper that had Kacie, her friends, and their numbers and home addresses on it. It's just so terrifying to think how meticulous this monster was. He planned everything to a T. Investigators also found a poem written by Kacie for her mom in David's possession. Further digging showed that David used his David Fagan persona to not only groom Kacie, but 3 other girls in the past, too. It started in the winter of 2000, when he reached out to a girl in Michigan under the alias Dave Fagan and offered to buy her a plane ticket to California. Thankfully, the girl refused. Otherwise, can you imagine what could have gone down if the poor girl went to California to meet Dave? Next, 2 years after the fact, he targeted a girl in Dallas, Texas, and asked for her home address to send her some flowers. But this plan failed too, because the girl was smart and she never gave her address to him. Kacie, unfortunately, was not so streetwise, and she fell into David's catfishing trap, and it cost her life. Kacie just wanted a friend, but what she got instead was David Fuller. The investigators also found out this wasn't the first time David had visited Arkansas. After meeting Kacie on Yahoo, he traveled to Arkansas 3 times in the fall of 2002. He arrived at Clinton National Airport, rented a car, and went to a Motel 6 in Conway, and it's alleged that he spied on Kacie during his stay there. This can't be confirmed, though, because David isn't here to speak for himself, but I don't think anyone would be shocked if this was eventually proven to be true. The detectives soon learned that the firearm he used on Kacie and himself was purchased in November of 2002. He told his kids that he was getting a firearm for target practice, which was obviously a lie. He also went to GuardSmart and looked at a large storage unit before renting one, the same one he and Kacie would soon be found in. This was oddly around the same time when Kacie and Jessica heard the mysterious intruders inside her home. Looking back, Jessica and Samantha believed that the intruder was David, but he was unable to carry out his plans, maybe because he knew Kacie wasn't alone or for some other reason. It's also believed he was scoping the area before he put his plans into motion, which is just chilling to think about. This man had successfully made his way into the home of these 3 teenage girls, and he did so largely undetected until the floor creaked, that is. When David returned to California, he bought chains, zip ties, and tape from his local Home Depot, and even got his hands on chloroform from a chemical supply company. In December, he decided to put his plans into action, and when he found out that Kacie would be home alone, he drove from California to Arkansas in his Buick Regal, and he told Kacie he was coming to see his aunt. But spoiler alert, there was no aunt. This was David's sick and twisted way of gaining Kacie's trust. Kacie's funeral was held on December 9th, 6 days after she'd gone missing. She was laid to rest right next to her mother, Christy, in South Crossroads Church Cemetery in Rosebud, Arkansas. Soon after all this unfolded, Kacie's family founded a nonprofit organization called the Kacie Woody Foundation. And the idea behind it was to warn children about internet safety and help them to not fall into the same trap that Kacie did. Rick was so devastated and riddled with guilt that he couldn't protect his daughter from a predator. He thought that as long as Kacie was home, she was safe. But he lost his daughter in the worst way, and still thinks about the what-ifs and whether things could have turned out differently. Kacie's case is quite possibly the first thoroughly documented case of a predator using the internet to groom, abduct, and murder a teen. And it was an equally devastating one. The internet has made things more convenient, no doubt. But crossing over to the dark side of the World Wide Web and how predators and monsters are sitting on the other side of the screen, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting victims, it's a scary thought. These days, predators are more prevalent than ever, far more so than when this unfolded back in 2002. The thing I miss the most about the early days of the internet is that when you were done with it, you just turn it off and leave it where it was. If you found out your kids are using the internet irresponsibly, you could just take it away. These days, that's much more complicated, and in some situations, it's impossible. The main thing we all need to remember is that when you give a young kid or a teen a cell phone, a tablet, a laptop, a computer, whatever it is, you're not just giving your kid access to the internet. You're giving the internet access to your kid. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I wanted to give a special thank you to a couple channel members, including Lonnie Meyer Sr. and Justin Berg. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public. And it's a great way to support the channel and help out. And I really appreciate those of you who have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video or find a link down in the description. And don't forget, True Crime Stories t-shirts are also now available. You can grab one of those from a link down in the description as well. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. What's worse, knowing what happened to your loved one or not having any clue at all? I'm sure it's not an easy side to pick. Some people want closure, and as painful as it may be, they want to know the harrowing details when it comes to homicide investigations. But some can't comprehend knowing what their loved one went through in their final moments, and for them, ignorance is bliss. The Smith family was desperately trying to find answers about their newly married son's disappearance back in 2005. George was on his honeymoon with his wife, Jennifer, and they just got married 11 days before this tragic event. Investigators quickly narrowed things down to two possibilities, either an accident or foul play. But obviously, this didn't really give George's family any sort of answers. When you add to this all the various twists, such as untrustworthy people also being on this vacation, as well as an unexpected murder investigation, well, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. The most important being, where is George Smith? George Allen Smith IV was born on October 3, 1978, in Glenville, Connecticut, to parents George Sr. and Maureen. The Smith family owned a liquor store called Coe's Cobb Liquors, and it was run by George's dad. It was a very successful business, and it was a pretty famous place in the Greenwich area. But it was more than just a store or a business for the Smiths and the community. It was a family of sorts, and all of the workers and customers basically knew each other. It was a 38-year-old business venture, and it was the reason why the Smiths could live comfortably, have food on the table, and pay for their children's education. George attended Babson College in Massachusetts after graduating from Greenwich High School. At college, he studied business. He continued to work in Boston as a computer data mining analyst for a couple of years, and it's safe to say that George was very smart and driven. Even though George grew up with everything he wanted, he wasn't a spoiled rich kid. He was very down-to-earth and hardworking. Now, George loved working in Boston, as it was competitive, challenging, and fun, but his heart was still at home. So he decided to quit his job and come back home to manage the family business. George had a great teacher too, his dad, and under his supervision, George became a pretty decent store manager. Fast forward to 2002. George was at a reunion with his friends where he crossed paths with Jennifer Hagel. She was an elementary school teacher and also had lived in Connecticut all of her life. George and Jennifer, they immediately clicked. They were like two puzzle pieces meant to come together, and so it wasn't long until the pair started dating. George's family also loved Jennifer. She was beautiful, young, and an ambitious woman who completed George in every way. 3 years into the relationship, George and Jennifer got married at the Castle Hill Inn overlooking the water. Their wedding ceremony was like it was ripped straight from the pages of a fairy tale, and it was a blissful day for everyone. After the wedding, like every couple, Jennifer and George had their honeymoon planned. It was a cruise trip, and they decided to go with Royal Caribbean International. It was a 2-week Mediterranean cruise, having scheduled stops in Greece, Turkey, and Italy, among other picturesque and out-of-this-world locations cutting through the Aegean Sea. The couple boarded the MS Brilliance of the Seas from Barcelona on June 29th, ready to enjoy their first days as newlyweds in the middle of the ocean. But this honeymoon would be anything but dreamy and romantic. Rather, it would become a nightmare that would ruin George's family forever, sending them on a decades-long search for their son who vanished from the ship, surrounded by clear blue, yet dangerously deep waters. July 5th was a calm sea day, and the cruise ship was sailing through the waters of the Aegean Sea towards its next destination. At around 8 a.m., a passenger on deck 7 looked out of her window, hoping to catch a beautiful view of the sea and the sun in perfect harmony. But what caught her eye was not blue and yellow, but a haunting and seemingly never-ending smear of red on the ship's canopy. Luckily, she didn't brush this incident off, and she reported it to the cabin staff immediately. Not long after, the passengers on board the cruise ship were freaked out and terrified that a passenger may have gone overboard. A while later, the captain of the ship went into the room where the blood was trailing from, and it was the fateful cabin of 9062. And they didn't know it by then, but this was Jennifer and George's cabin. Well, the captain entered the room, and it didn't take him long to realize that something had happened here. The whole room was trashed. Everything was on the floor, the bed was messed up, things were strewn everywhere, and it looked like the place had been ransacked. There were footprints on the cabin floor, and right by the balcony, a chair was flush against the glass railing, which was pretty unusual. The glass was also smeared with what investigators would later describe as a hip impression. It was as if someone was perched by the hip on the railing, dangerously close to the edge of the ship. Moreover, the bed sheets also had 2 very significant red marks, each about 2 centimeters long. This blood sadly tested positive for George. There were also red marks in various other places, including the ship's awning. But the couple in cabin 9062 were nowhere to be found. If that wasn't enough, the sight of red leading from the balcony door alarmed everyone, and they knew that whatever went down in this cabin on deck 7 was horrific. They just didn't know what it was that happened. But first, they had to find the occupants of the cabin, and they quickly found out that Jennifer and George Smith were staying there. 2 hours later, there was still no sign of 26-year-old George, but Jennifer was eventually found. She was at the spa indulging in a pre-booked massage. When the captain and other crew members alerted Jennifer of her husband's disappearance, she was genuinely shocked and concerned. Jennifer had not seen George since the night before, and now he was gone, leaving behind a very eerie trail of unanswered questions. A couple of hours into the discovery of the ransacked cabin, at around noon, the Turkish authorities were called onto the ship to begin the investigation of George's disappearance. Since Jennifer was the only one who was with George that night before, the investigators wanted to question her for details. They also checked security cameras and were able to piece together what had happened the night before. In the police's eyes, Jennifer's behavior was out of the ordinary. She had not seen George since the night before, and when she woke up the next day, instead of searching for her husband, she went to the spa, which honestly should have been the last thing on her mind. Even so, the police wanted to know who the couple interacted with the night before. In their eyes, everyone who was with George needed to be spoken to. Jennifer claimed that she and George struck up a conversation with another American passenger, 20-year-old Josh Askin, as soon as they boarded the ship. The trio went to different places and enjoyed the first 4 to 5 days together, exploring exotic towns, eating delicious foods, and just taking in all the beauty. According to Jennifer, on the night of July 4th, the couple and Josh decided to go to the casino. And there, Josh and George were entertaining themselves while Jennifer was playing poker. They also went to a disco afterward. That night, they had a lot to drink and lost tons of money at poker. Investigators also checked the security footage, and the last sighting of George was at around 2:30 a.m. in the casino. But tragically, he wasn't seen after that. The investigators knew that they had to question Josh to corroborate Jennifer's version of events. And when they found him, well, Josh had a lot to say about that night. First of all, Josh said that Jennifer and George didn't leave the disco together. Jennifer was with the casino manager, Lloyd, and they were getting pretty comfy in each other's presence at the casino, even in front of George, Jennifer's husband of just a few days. Security cameras also showed Jennifer staggering out of the ship's disco at around 3:30 a.m., leaving George with his new friends. And interestingly enough, Lloyd's keycard showed that he came back to his room at about 3:25 a.m. Now, this led the detectives to become very suspicious of Jennifer and Lloyd. Their stories were completely different, and they seemed to be more than just friends. Were the two together after leaving the disco? What was going on? The investigators were very confused. But now things were about to get even more complex when 3 more people entered the investigation. They were Greg and Zach Rosenberg, both of whom were cousins, and a friend of theirs named Rusty. 19-year-old Greg was the one playing poker with Jennifer, and the rest of the gang was with George and Josh. The trio also joined the group to the disco after the casino. The 3 men were Russian, but they had American passports and were living in New York at the time. Now, the group of young men also had too much to drink, and they were being very loud and obnoxious. The ship's crew were instructed to not serve more alcohol to these men or deliver it to their rooms, but that didn't stop Zach, Greg, and Rusty because they'd smuggled a bottle of absinthe with the help of George. See, the trio had purchased this absinthe when they were docked in Greece, and since passengers, especially underage ones, weren't allowed to bring alcohol on board, George helped them out by hiding the bottle in his shorts. Now, something you need to know about absinthe is that it is very strong. The alcohol level in this particular bottle was anywhere from 40 to 70%. It's illegal in Europe, but the composition is highly regulated by European Union standards. So the trio, George and even Josh, downed a lot of absinthe, and this didn't go unnoticed by the crew on the ship, including a janitor. The trio, Josh and George, consumed a lot of alcohol that night. But it wasn't just the guys. Jennifer was also drunk by the end of it all, especially after 2:30 a.m. She was very disoriented, as is evidenced by the security cameras when she was seen at 3:30. Several witnesses saw her leaning on Lloyd and even having a physical altercation with George, which ended with her striking George pretty hard. Now, it's unclear whether George and Jennifer were bickering or if they were just wiped out drunk, but Jennifer did leave the disco at 3:30 a.m. and was assisted to the elevator by the same janitor who saw the guys consuming the absinthe. But this was where investigators noticed something weird. Cabin 9062 was located at the left of the elevator on deck 7. But Jennifer went the other way, making a right, and she was eventually found asleep in the hallway. She was so inebriated that she had to be wheeled in a wheelchair to her room by a female officer and 2 guards. When Jennifer and the guards entered the cabin a little before 5 a.m., it was eerily quiet, and the curtains were completely drawn. While the police were figuring everything out, they were approached by another couple right next to cabin 9062, and they admitted to hearing a scuffle next door. The couple was sleeping when they heard shouting, the movement of furniture, footsteps, rustling, and finally a loud thud. It all happened at 4 a.m., before Jennifer was even wheeled back into the cabin. The couple did report this incident to guest services, and the man next door also opened his door and stepped into the hallway after this, and he saw 3 men standing there but was unable to identify any of them. Other witnesses and passengers also heard the noticeable thud noise, along with a woman's scream, but there weren't any eyewitness reports that a woman was inside the cabin. They only saw 4 men entering the cabin, but after this weird incident, only 3 came out. This detail left everyone wondering. Did something happen to George before Jennifer was wheeled into the room? Was he with the 3 Russian guys that he met at the casino? And did George fall accidentally, or was he pushed? The investigators were highly suspicious of the 3 men who met the young couple at the casino. George's keycard showed that Greg, Zach, and Rusty entered cabin 9062 at around 4:05 a.m., and after the couple next door saw the 3 men in the hallway, they went somewhere else. The most tragic part about all of this is that George's body could not be recovered. It was impossible, and without a body, convicting someone for murder or foul play would be hard. There are several theories out there as to what might have happened to George on that fateful night. The first and most believable one is that it was a robbery gone wrong. It's believed that Zach, Greg, and Rusty were looking for naive travelers and had plans to rob them by earning their trust and getting them severely drunk. Also, it didn't go unnoticed that George was sporting a very expensive watch, which was a gift from Jennifer, and Jennifer had a huge and insanely expensive engagement ring. Moreover, witnesses stated that George and Jennifer didn't shy away from boasting about their wealth, and they had tens of thousands of dollars with them. And this is never a smart move. If you've got money, please don't act like it, or my next video might be about you. So it is possible that the trio got wind of this, and they purposefully made George and Jennifer consume a lot of alcohol and absinthe to wipe them out completely. Also, the cabin was completely trashed. Maybe they were looking for money. If you remember the 2-centimeter long red stains on the sheets, well, detectives say that these were consistent with someone forcefully pulling on George's watch. The second theory has to do with a freak accident. Truth is, the group of men got drunk to the point of no return, so it is possible that George, while trying to get bearings of his surroundings, just fell overboard and no one could save him. The group was drinking absinthe with high levels of alcohol and thujo, an active hallucinogen. But since the absinthe was purchased in Europe, which has stricter regulations in the composition of absinthe with tolerable levels of thujone, this theory is not as believable since it can't be backed up by evidence. But in the meantime, the FBI also joined the investigation, and their main focus was to interview everyone who was with George and Jennifer on that fateful night. Josh and Jennifer took polygraph tests, and even though Jennifer passed, Josh failed the test. What was very bizarre was that a videotape of the 3 Russians also surfaced, in which they were joking about the incident, saying things like, quote, "We gave him a lesson in paragliding without a parachute." They were also heard repeatedly saying, "We never saw him, end of story." It's such a weird thing to say, especially considering the paragliding detail points towards the fact that George may have fallen overboard. And what is it with that second statement? Obviously, the men were with George that night. Multiple witnesses saw them. So how they expected investigators to believe that they weren't there that night, no one knows. But anyway, in 2009, the FBI questioned the 4 men, including Josh, and weirdly enough, Zach and Josh were very vague and continually invoked the Fifth Amendment right, which granted them the right to not testify in court. Only Greg was forthcoming with information, but even that info was quite ambiguous. According to Greg, the men ordered room service that night, which was their only form of an alibi. Now, this was weird in itself because the cruise ship staff were instructed not to serve the men anything else that evening, and it seems that this rule included serving them food. To add to this oddness, Greg doesn't remember who ordered the room service, he just knows that it was ordered at some point. What Greg knew for sure was that everyone was highly inebriated. Even though Greg's version of events was also pretty choppy, he did say one thing with certainty, and that was the fact that whatever happened to George wasn't accidental. He didn't explain further, but he did say that something crazy happened that fateful night that would soon be uncovered. But he wouldn't live long enough to guide the FBI, because in December of 2019, Greg was found murdered in front of his home inside of his car after being hit at close range with multiple rounds. What's so eerie is that Greg's death still remains unsolved to this day. I mean, it's oddly convenient. Greg says something about George's death getting uncovered soon, and then he mysteriously and inexplicably turns up dead. It's just something you can't shrug off like it's no big deal. The tragic and unexplainable disappearance of George Smith shook his family to the core. When they got that terrifying phone call from detectives that George had likely gone overboard, the Smith family could not believe what they were hearing. Having your son go missing is terrifying, but on another continent, and probably in the vast, deep waters of the ocean, that's another level of hopelessness. The Smith family made sure that the authorities felt the pressure to solve this case quickly and give justice to George, but it wasn't that easy. They made appeals to the public. They offered a $100,000 reward for any information on George's disappearance to solve the case. And the Smith family also pushed for boycotting Royal Caribbean International for their disinterest in solving George's disappearance, since the cruise company tried to keep everything hush-hush, and they even disturbed the cabin, quite possibly a crime scene, by cleaning up all of the evidence within hours of George's disappearance, which is just unbelievable. It's believed that the cruise company simply didn't want to get bad press because of all this. The Smith family also suspected Jennifer. In their eyes, she was too cool, calm, and collected. It also didn't help that she wasn't looking for her husband the next morning and chose to go to the spa instead. But if I'm being honest, I don't really think this is too bizarre. I mean, Jennifer was almost certainly having one heck of a hangover. Yes, the room was trashed and she would have noticed this, but it was a long night for them both. The room was bound to be trashed. I just don't think it's too much of a leap to say that she simply didn't notice the spots of blood on the sheets, got dressed, and went out for her spa day to help lessen her hangover, but that's just my opinion. Regardless, for a long time, Jennifer was a prime suspect in the eyes of the Smith family. But strangely, Jennifer did appear pretty tight-lipped about the incident. She wouldn't share any information about the incident publicly. But again, in Jennifer's defense, the FBI told her not to say anything to the press, so she was just following orders. The Smith family also couldn't contain their surprise when Jennifer agreed to settle the matter with the cruise company for just $1 million. This to them seemed like Jennifer was hiding something. Jennifer was quick to come to her own defense though, and said that she just genuinely doesn't remember anything about that night after about 2:30 a.m. She doesn't even remember sleeping in the hallway or being taken back to her room in a wheelchair. Now, sure, her actions were questionable, but there's just no evidence that she was in the room when George was attacked or when he accidentally fell, or any evidence that she knew anything about it. I also don't think a $1 million settlement is too suspicious. I mean, yes, it's a relatively small amount of money considering that George was likely murdered, but trying to prove that the cruise company was somehow liable would be pretty difficult. And when you add on top a severe lack of evidence and the grief that Jennifer was almost certainly experiencing, I just don't think a $1 million payout was too crazy. The Smith family also pointed fingers at the Turkish investigators, who were very vague about sharing information regarding the case with George's family. With all this in mind, the Smith family hired forensic scientist Henry Lee to help find answers to the haunting and jarring questions related to what happened to their son. Even though all of the evidence was gone at that point, Henry managed to conduct several tests in the cabin, and just by looking at the balcony and the railing height, he was certain that George's fall was not accidental. Someone had to have pushed George forcefully for him to fall over that railing. But he also couldn't rule out the fact that maybe George was just too inebriated to really take into account what he was doing, and he lost his balance and went overboard, which explains the peculiar location of the chair and the hip mark on the glass. People do crazy stuff when they're drunk, and falling out of an open window has happened many times in the past with drunk people. But while this is certainly plausible, I, along with pretty much anyone else who's researched this case, tends to believe there's a lot more to the story than a simple accidental fall. To confirm one theory or the other, Henry wanted to recreate the fall both ways with the help of a dummy to check the smear patterns found on the ship's canopy. But this is where Royal Caribbean International intervened and said they would not allow it, leaving George's very confusing case hanging in the balance yet again. Frustratingly, Henry's findings in the case were confidential and were never made public, so we don't know what Henry uncovered when he analyzed the cabin and the balcony. All the while, the FBI was focused on the four men, Josh, Greg, Zach, and Rusty. But that investigation also went nowhere because of a lack of evidence. The Smith family did eventually cross Jennifer off their suspect list, and in the end, the lawsuit against the cruise company was settled for a slightly higher amount of $1.3 million, which was divided among the Smiths and Jennifer. The FBI continued the investigation until 2015, when it was finally decided that there wasn't enough evidence to carry this investigation forward, and George's death was ruled as an accident. The case was closed on January 7, 2015, almost 10 years after George had disappeared. As of this decision, Josh, Zach, Greg, and Rusty are not suspects or even people of interest anymore. The FBI, Turkish authorities, or anyone for that matter, doesn't know where George's body may be. In an ocean that covers 70% of the planet, and to add to that 20 years since George disappeared, the chances of finding his body were and still are next to none. The Smith family was outraged and disgusted by this decision by the FBI. They said in a Facebook post that they were planning to take George's case to the New York jurisdiction of the FBI, and rightfully so because they need answers. But we have to keep in mind, all of the evidence is just gone, and that sucks. As for Jennifer, she remarried a few years later in 2009 and has devoted her life to charity work and now has 2 children. The case of George Smith IV has officially been labeled an accident, but no one, myself included, believes that story. No one truly knows whether George accidentally fell over the balcony or was pushed by one of those men, or something else entirely. But this is a very unsettling and tragic case that even after almost 20 years, the Smith family is still looking for answers to. They know nothing will bring George back, but they desperately want something done so that they can find some level of closure. The fact that George's body isn't and cannot be recovered adds a whole other layer of pain and suffering. My heart very genuinely goes out to the Smith family, who are spending every hour of their days in uncertainty, trying to fight for answers. We can only hope that they can find some semblance of peace, even though it's nearly impossible when they just don't know what happened to their son. On a cold December day in 2020, 19-year-old Christian Hall dialed 911. Not to report a crime though, but to beg for help. Within 90 minutes, his life would be over, taken by the very officers who were sent to save him. What happened on that Pennsylvania overpass has since become one of the most shocking and controversial police crimes in recent American history. A toy weapon, a desperate cry for help, and a series of fatal decisions that still haunt an entire community. Christian Hall was born on October 31st, 2001 in Shanghai, China. Not much is known about Christian during his early days in China, but what we can say for sure is that when Christian was just a year old, he was taken in by a family in the United States in 2002. It was the Hall family. Faye and Gareth Hall adopted him and legally changed his name to Christian, as we know him today. We don't know why Christian was put up for adoption in the first place, but regardless, the Hall family made the move to New York later on and then finally settled in Poconos, Pennsylvania, to give Christian a stable and loving home. Christian was defined as a very sweet kid. He never really caused any trouble at all. His mom, Faye, loved Christian's laugh more than anything. and the goofy sounds he always made to make other people laugh. But everything wasn't sunshine and rainbows in Christian's life. Even though he was pretty young when this monumental change came about, as he grew up, he started to show signs of reactive attachment disorder. It's a rare disorder that's found to be more common in adopted or fostered children. Basically, these kids have a hard time establishing relationships or healthy attachments with their parents or caregivers. This is why it's a very big responsibility for adoptive parents to provide a very seamless, nurturing, and caring home life for these kids. Adopting kids can be very difficult, and I don't mean just for the parents, but mostly for the kids, even if they never know they've been adopted. It's a very interesting topic that we don't really know much about, but it's very real. Kids with reactive attachment disorder can experience irritability or distance with their parents, hesitance in showing emotions, and failure to warm up to their adoptive parents. So this was what Christian was up against. Now, even though this sounds like a really life-altering disorder, it's not impossible to treat. With the right care, attention, and counseling, kids can turn this disorder around. Now, that said, as Christian was getting a bit older, he started to act out a bit. He would run away from home, but nothing too serious because he'd always be found within a few hours. Still, I'm sure the Hall family was really worried. Then when Christian was 10, he accidentally set an empty room in a nursing home ablaze when playing with matches, but luckily no one was hurt. But this incident did lead to Christian's first brush with the law. He was placed in a juvenile detention facility for 4 years. He was released from the facility after doing his time, but since he had a habit of running away often, he would violate probation and would be punished for it by being sent back to the facility. This was a constant loop until he turned 18. By December of 2020, before the events of today's case transpired, Christian was doing well, and he was actually working at a local grocery store to help pay off the restitution fee for starting the fire in that nursing home, which totaled $14,000. Christian was going to school, and he was also taking his sessions on counseling and therapy with his doctor. He also had a girlfriend at the time, but the relationship was best defined as on and off again. There's nothing to indicate that Faye and Gareth neglected Christian by any means either, and in fact it was quite the opposite. Their hometown in Pennsylvania housed less than 6,000 people, and in a small town like this, finding good healthcare professionals for such a rare disorder like reactive attachment disorder, it was hard. But Faye and Gareth managed to find a doctor for Christian, and he took those sessions. The two of them made sure that Christian mingled with their family, and he was actually pretty close with the extended Hall family. They celebrated holidays together, they got together often, and things were good. Until they weren't. I'm sure we all remember the infamous year of 2020. It was a hard time for everyone, and reports suggest that mental health crises were at an all-time high, increasing more than 25% during that time. So it definitely wasn't the best time in anyone's lives, and this went on for years before things kind of went back to normal. So in a world where disease and uncertainty were at their peak, everyone's mental state was derailing, and Christian was no exception either. He was already quite vulnerable, and he needed a stable surrounding in order to heal and overcome his problems. But that whole year basically wiped all of those efforts away, and Christian and his mental health came tumbling down. He was even more anxious and reserved, and he was just going through a lot, which is heartbreaking. And I think a lot of us can relate to feeling the same way around that time. But he was just 19 and craved stability. And even though Faye and Gareth were wonderful parents and never once made Christian feel less than loved or like a throwaway child, things just weren't working out for him. On top of this, he and his girlfriend also went through a bad breakup, and this just messed with him even more. If that wasn't enough, Christian's doctor also had to move away too, and now there was no reactive attachment disorder specialist anywhere in this area. But that didn't stop Gareth and Faye though. They still tried their best to look for specialists or doctors even on the outskirts of where they lived, but they were hitting one dead end after another. But before they could get Christian the help he needed, even more tragedy would strike. So Christian was working at a local grocery store in December of 2020, and he usually walked or was driven to work. He was also in the midst of getting his driver's license, and he was studying for the test. Just a day before the tragic event that broke the Hall family to pieces, Christian had gone out with his family to his aunt's house for her birthday. Christian was doing okay at the time, but on the drive back home, his parents noticed that he was upset while talking about his ex-girlfriend. Now, we don't know the context, but from the information available, it's assumed that Christian learned that his former girlfriend was moving on and showing interest in another guy. For Christian, this essentially cemented the fact that his relationship was over, and it hit him like a truck. This concerned Faye and Gareth immediately, and they tried their best to comfort Christian. But still, it never crossed their minds that Christian would have such dark thoughts as he was about to experience. Then December 30th rolled around. Chris's mom was in charge of dropping Christian off at his shift at the grocery store, and that was exactly what she did. She literally remembers the day like it was yesterday. She genuinely thought that Christian would be back home in a couple of hours and they'd have dinner and veg out on the couch later that evening. But nothing could have prepared her for just how wrong she would be. While Christian was supposed to be at work, instead, he found himself armed and standing at the Pennsylvania Route 33 overpass on Interstate 80. From the looks of it, Christian was not doing well. But before that, he had made a call. Not to his parents, though, and not to his friends either. He dialed 911. He called the police, and according to the recorded call, he sounded distraught and in distress, and he told the dispatcher that there was a mental health emergency and that the police were needed at the scene. The operator dispatched a set of troopers and Pennsylvania Police Department officers to the scene. And when they arrived, they saw Christian Hall standing way too close to the edge of the overpass. The police didn't need any confirmation that the guy standing in front of them was about to jump. Christian and the police officers stood at a distance of about 70 feet from each other. And when one of the officers glanced down, he immediately instructed everyone to take cover. There was something in Chris's hands. He was clutching what looked like a weapon. But just remember this detail because we'll get back to that in a moment. But the troopers were positioned behind their vehicles, and that was when a 90-minute standoff began. The Pennsylvania State Troopers started to persuade Christian to drop the weapon that he was holding and walk away from the ledge. The officers also called for safety vans and other life-saving emergency personnel at the bottom of that ledge so that the impact of a fall could be lessened, if not avoided completely. But Christian didn't budge. He was not following orders to drop what he was holding, and after some time he was seen pacing around the overpass, sometimes close to the officers and sometimes going back over to the ledge of the overpass. At one point, Christian even put the weapon down, and this led the officers to sigh in relief. But it was short-lived because, for some reason, Chris picked up the weapon again, even though the officers were ordering and demanding that he not do it. At around 1:38 p.m., after the 90-minute standoff, Christian apparently lifted his arm while holding the weapon, and that was when the police officers pulled their triggers. He had sustained 7 injuries at the hands of the police, and after this very tense incident ended in horror, Christian was taken to Lehigh Valley Hospital in Pocono, but tragically he could not be revived. He'd lost his life at the hands of Pennsylvania State Troopers. He called for mental health distress, and instead of getting the help that he wanted, it's one thing for Christian to meet his untimely end if the person behind the trigger was a robber or some random person out for blood. But these were police officers. They were called to the scene to help Christian, but they took his life. After Christian was pronounced deceased at the hospital, the first thing there was to do was to inform his family. Gareth and Faye were made aware of what had gone down on the I-80 overpass, and honestly, at first, they probably thought someone was just messing with them. How could Christian be on Pennsylvania Route 33? He was supposed to be at work. But when the reality came crashing in and Faye and Gareth saw Christian's body, the same boy they opened their arms and home for, their whole world came crashing down. And when they found out that the people who pulled the trigger were none other than police officers, everything got so much worse. They were devastated and in utter shock, honestly. Their son had just lost his life in the most terrible way possible, and they wanted answers, and they wanted them now. What did Christian do to end up like this? What had happened? Well, according to the police, the Pennsylvania State Troopers, they said that Christian was a threat to the officers and to their lives. They said that Christian was armed, and during his final moments before the tragedy took place, They claimed that Christian had picked the weapon up off the ground and he'd aimed it in the direction of the police officers. This prompted the officers to act to defend themselves and their co-workers' safety. The police looked at Christian's phone records, and they found out that before he called 911, he'd posted a picture of the overpass on Snapchat with the caption, "Who would miss me?" This is heartbreaking, because this kid, seriously, he needed help. The state police's initial press release stated that Christian had tried to aim the weapon at the officers, but at this point, it was their word against everyone else. But there was one thing that surfaced about 2 months following Christian's passing. It was the video of the whole standoff, including the moment that led to Christian losing his life. The video was blurred for obvious reasons, and even though it didn't exactly show Christian aiming the weapon straight at the troopers, the police said that this was exactly what happened. It can be seen throughout the whole 90 minutes that the troopers are trying to persuade Christian to walk away from the ledge. And when they find out that he's armed, the officers take cover and huddle behind their vehicles, but negotiations carry on. Remember Christian put the weapon down at that one point? Well, during that time, he was supposedly seen smoking something, which was reported to be an illegal substance. According to one of the troopers who witnessed this whole standoff and Christian's demise, he recalled that during his final moments, Christian pointed towards his head, and he then pulled something out that looked like a weapon out of the waistband of his pants. And then, in no time, he pointed that weapon in the direction of the troopers. This was when the corporal can be seen lifting his weapon, and 3 deafening banging sounds are heard. But it seemed they all missed Christian. This is also where inconsistencies within the troopers and their version of events surfaced. In another video released by the district attorney, one trooper claimed something else entirely took place. He said that Christian never pointed the weapon at the troopers. In fact, this trooper stated that after the initial 3 rounds fired by the corporal, Christian bent his arms at a 90-degree angle and raised the weapon outwards towards his side. This angle and position would have caused the weapon to be aimed straight up at the sky, or at the very least, not at the troopers. So you can tell something was amiss. Whatever the troopers were saying was contradictory. Michael Mancuso, an assistant district attorney, called Christian an imminent threat from the moment they found out that he was armed. Well, that was when more things came forward, though, and it left a bad taste in everyone's mouths. First, let's talk about that supposed weapon that Christian was carrying. It was not an actual weapon. Sources say that it was either a toy weapon or a pellet gun. But get this, one of the troopers on scene had been a crisis negotiator for 15 years. That's a lot of experience. Moreover, another trooper had been a crisis intervention specialist and had a master's degree in counseling and clinical health psychology. The highest ranking trooper was a corporal, who pulled the trigger 3 times after Christian picked that weapon back up, and he had more than 20 years of experience. Now, whether this was a toy, a pellet gun, or something else, that's all beside the point, because whatever it was that Christian was holding, it didn't matter, because further evidence would prove that their stories may not have been entirely factual. Nine months after the first video of the I-80 tragedy was released, a new video surfaced, and this one was unredacted, unblurred. Remember how the first one was all blurred and it made it unclear what actually took place here? Well, the new version, it was the whole event in full. It showed the last few minutes of what went down on that fateful day at the overpass, and it was nothing like what the police claimed it to be. The video was released when the Pennsylvania Police Department was pressured by the Hall family attorneys. The footage was initially kept under wraps until the Hall family lawyers came forward and threatened legal action against the people and the department involved. This caused the police department to relent and release the video. Well, it's safe to say that when this video came out, a whole new event transpired, and now no one believed what the troopers said. The video was unblurred and was obviously very traumatizing to watch. Now, it was good that the video got released, because finally there was no more he said, she said. It was all clear as day. But it's a very traumatic thing as well, because it's Christian's last moments captured on camera. No one needs to see that. So what exactly was in the video? Well, state troopers basically built their case and course of action on the basis that Christian was aiming the weapon, better described as a toy, at them. This was why the troopers opened fire on Christian, and that was how he ultimately lost his life, because he was supposedly threatening the safety of the officers. Well, in this new unredacted video, it shows that Christian didn't, in fact, aim for the troopers, ever, in any way, shape, or form. His arms, including the one holding the toy, were raised above his head. And not just that, his hands were raised for a total of 14 seconds. Tragically, Christian was set upon by troopers while his hands were still in the air. He never once made any movements that could have been perceived as threatening. The toy was pointed straight at the sky the whole time, never at the troopers. Christian was maintaining the universal stance of surrender. He held that stance for 14 seconds, which is honestly enough time for experienced personnel like troopers to understand they should hold their fire. Now, it's a completely different thing for a civilian or someone inexperienced to mistake this stance for something else, but these are professional troopers with a lot of experience. They are literally trained to make quick decisions under pressure and avoid harm to the general public as much as possible. Now, you can also argue that maybe the troopers fired at Christian by mistake. That would be understandable if maybe one round went off, but 7 to 8 times? Christian was not a threat to anyone in his final moments. He was probably confused, very scared, already extremely vulnerable, and in a very tense situation. Also, I want to point out how the troopers persuaded Christian. They were not being polite about it at all. They were shouting at Christian at one point and being very domineering. Now, I do realize this was a stressful situation, but if the troopers knew that they couldn't handle a vulnerable person who was contemplating ending it all, then they should have called someone who could have negotiated better, because they started screaming, shouting demands at him almost immediately. This is not how you negotiate with a potentially violent person. It's just going to freak him out and likely make them even more violent. And I'm not saying Christian was violent. I'm just saying even if he was, this is not how you handle this. But certainly, without a doubt, someone who calls you and begs for your help and admits they're having a mental crisis, this isn't the right move. I can think of many crisis negotiations with highly dangerous people, and even they got better and more polite negotiators than Christian. It's clear to see from this footage, things were never going to end well for Christian. So, following all of this, an investigation was conducted. In the end, the loss of Chris's life was deemed justified. But that was before the unredacted video was released. It's bizarre to think that someone who's responsible for upholding the law is justifying this tragedy. Well, in the light of this revelation, the Hall family filed a federal wrongful death lawsuit in April of 2022. It was represented by attorney Benjamin Crump. The Hall family sued state police officials, including Commissioner Robert Evanchik, and prosecutors who led the investigation and protected the troopers by calling their actions justified. The lawsuit rides on the unredacted video of the incident and a command possibly given by one of the troopers in the background, who can be heard urging the other officers to fire upon Christian if he doesn't relent. This was said when Christian was repeatedly not following orders of dropping the pellet gun, which was mistaken for a real and dangerous weapon. While there haven't been any recent updates on the lawsuit, the family is pushing for an independent investigation to punish the troopers as well as everyone involved in their son's tragic passing. While they're waiting for the wheels of justice to move in the right direction, Gareth and Faye Hall have held many vigils to remember and honor their son and seek justice not only for Christian, but also for other people who've been victims of police violence. Faye and Gareth, they miss their son terribly. Faye still has Christian's jacket draped over his seat at the dining table. Birthday and Christmas cards and gifts left by Christian for his parents are the only things Faye and Gareth can hold on to while they remember their son. Christian's belongings are left untouched in the Hall family hall. Faye and Gareth, they can't bring themselves to remove or put anything back because this is the way Christian touched and used these things before he left them alone forever. It's devastating to think about what Faye and Gareth have been going through all these years. Their son needed help, and he even called the police, either to help him get out of this dark hole or something else. That's another debate for another day, but what's inarguable is that the police should have handled it better. Christian, didn't deserve to have his life taken away like this, and then for it to be called justified, it's no less than a slap in the face for Christian's family. You can argue back and forth all day long whether or not this was justified, but Christian never aimed a weapon at those officers. He was scared, but he did nothing but try to comply with their demands, and they took his life anyway. I cannot even fathom the shock that Christian must have been feeling in that moment, to finally resort to calling 911 of all people in the midst of a mental health crisis, only for them to show up, start shouting at you, and then draw their weapons. I just really hope that Faye and Gareth succeed in this very grueling fight for justice. "13-year-old Bradley Hansen left his home on November 10th, 1995, without telling his mother that school had been canceled. Instead, he snuck over to a friend's home and never returned. When trash collectors visited the area later on to empty the bins, workers noticed some concerning evidence inside one of the neighborhood trash cans. But unfortunately, this small amount of evidence wasn't enough to lead to a conviction, at least not yet. But when investigators finally revealed their primary suspect, Bradley's family was shocked because the crime hit much closer to home than any of them could have expected. Bradley Hansen was your average teenage boy growing up in the mid-90s. Being 13, he had just reached the age where he was starting to become interested in finding a girlfriend, and there were plenty of girls his age at his school in Phoenix, Arizona. Bradley was enrolled at Centennial Middle School in Phoenix, where he'd established a core group of friends that he felt he could depend on. One of his closest friends was a kid named Jeremy Bach, and Jeremy and Bradley were pretty much inseparable. The two would often hang out before school started, and they were the first two kids to meet up after school had ended, too. It was November of 1995. Brad and Jeremy were speaking sometime earlier that month about Veterans Day, a popular holiday here in the United States. Knowing that the two would be off of school for the holiday, they'd been excitedly planning on what they could do with all their free time. But the crazy thing is, Brad's mother didn't even realize that the children would be out of school for the holiday, and Brad had no plans of telling her. We don't know if he kept this information a secret from his mother because he feared that she may interfere with his plans, or if he simply didn't realize that his mother was unaware of the holiday. But whatever the case was, Brad and Jeremy had quite a day ahead of them. When Veterans Day finally rolled around, it was November 10th, and Brad woke up that morning, got dressed, and prepared for the day as it were any other. He then hopped on a bike that he had borrowed from his neighbor and headed off in the direction of the school. His mother watched him leave and, obviously believing it was a school day, didn't think much else about the situation. But as we know, Brad had no plans of going to school that day. Somewhere along the way, Brad changed course and began heading toward his friend Jeremy's house. It's believed that one of the reasons why Brad was so excited about his plans that day was because a girl named Taylor was expected to show up at Jeremy's house later on that afternoon. Taylor was a friend from school, and if I had to guess, one or both of these boys likely had a bit of a crush on the girl. And considering everyone's parents were at work for the day, you can only imagine what must have been going through these teenagers' minds when Taylor agreed to stop by for a visit. Now, we don't know for sure what the boys had planned on getting up to while they had the entire day to themselves, but the fact that they kept their plans a secret from their parents seems to allude to the idea that they may have been getting up to no good. Now, I can't say this with any certainty, but considering what would take place just a few short hours later, well, this theory may not be as far-fetched as it seems. No sooner than Brad arrived at Jeremy's house, the two ran into Jeremy's stepdad, Daniel, in the kitchen. It seems that Jeremy's dad also didn't realize the boys were off from school for the day, as he claims he was under the impression that the boys would be heading off soon after he left at around 7 a.m. that morning. Needless to say, the boys were over the moon that they had managed to fend off their parents and claim the entire day to themselves, meaning they could do pretty much anything they wanted with no supervision. A scary thing for two teenage boys. But their plans were nearly foiled, because at around 8 a.m., Brad's mom, Rhonda, had a sudden realization that it was Veterans Day. She began paging Brad repeatedly. Mind you, this is 1995, but Brad never responded. She sent him several pages all throughout the day, but Brad simply refused to answer. Rhonda didn't get off of work until 2 p.m. that afternoon, but once she got back home, she still couldn't locate Brad. This was very much unlike him to not respond to his mother's pages and calls. While Brad was your average, reckless teenage boy, he always made sure to stay in touch with his mother, so the fact that he'd suddenly dropped off the map sent every alarm in Rhonda's head ringing. Rhonda reached out to several of her neighbors and friends and tried to determine if anyone had seen Brad that day, but no one had any idea where he may have gone. She even called several of Brad's friends and classmates, but no one reported anything. Rhonda eventually decided to call Jeremy, and that's when things got interesting. Jeremy opened up to Rhonda about what the boys had been up to that morning, but the problem was Jeremy claimed that Brad had left sometime early that morning, but he had no idea where he may have gone. As far as Jeremy knew, he simply hopped on his bike and left, pedaling off into the distance. Rhonda asked Jeremy that if he sees Brad, to let him know that if he's not home by 5 p.m., she'll be calling the police to file a missing person report. Jeremy agreed, and the two hung up the phone. Now, there's some unusual information about what took place immediately after this call with Jeremy. It's been reported that Rhonda decided to call Jeremy's stepfather, Daniel, who explained that he'd last seen both of the boys at 7 a.m. that morning. Daniel explained that he'd speak with Jeremy as soon as he got home, and that he would report back with any information he managed to find. But immediately after the call, Rhonda decided that she just couldn't sit around and wait for Brad to show up. She had to do something. Thus, she hopped in her car and started traveling to all of the nearby hangout spots, desperately hoping to find some trace of Brad. But she never did. And later that evening, things took a turn for the worse. Once Jeremy's stepfather, Daniel, got off of work later that evening, he spoke with Jeremy just as he said he would. But after the two spoke, for reasons that remain unclear, Daniel never bothered calling Rhonda back. He knew that Rhonda was still actively searching for her missing son, yet never bothered to pick up the phone. When police arrived to take statements from Rhonda, it seems as though they initially classified Brad's disappearance as a runaway case. They didn't know why, but they believed Brad had likely run away from home. But Rhonda didn't believe this to be true. She felt that something terrible had happened to her son, and believed there was no chance he would run away like this. But it seems as though detectives were largely undeterred by her claims, and pushed forward in their own way. When Brad still never returned home that night, Rhonda's fears and concerns began to grow to epic proportions. Police seemed to have requested that Rhonda not go around and investigate her son's disappearance on her own, seemingly for fear of hindering their own investigation. But Rhonda didn't obey their wishes, and she went to the ends of the earth to try to find her boy. She spent the entire weekend speaking to everyone she knew that had ever met Brad, hoping someone had some sort of information, but no one did. That is, except for a couple of Brad's classmates. After Brad had disappeared, there were rumors circulating around the school that something terrible had happened to him. The rumors would suggest that a gunshot had been heard ringing out in the mid-afternoon on the day that Brad went missing. These rumors suggested that Jeremy and Brad had found a weapon inside the home that day, and Jeremy had accidentally fired a single round, which narrowly missed Brad and got lodged into the wall. But these rumors grew far more concerning when it was suggested that Brad was now in possession of the weapon, and he may have planned on using it to end his own life. Now, this may sound like a sudden and unexpected jump in the story, and it certainly is. Rather obviously, up until this point, there had been no reason for anyone to suspect that Brad would have been capable of such a thing, nor was he ever described as being depressed. This only made Rhonda and the police all the more suspicious about these rumors. But the thing is, a rumor has to start somewhere. So it's possible there may have been more truth to this story than anyone else cared to admit. Daniel, Jeremy's stepfather, would call Rhonda sometime around November 13th, about 3 days after Brad had gone missing. During their call, Rhonda opened up about the rumors that she had heard regarding Brad's intentions. Daniel assured Rhonda that these were nothing more than rumors, and even went as far as calling home to his girlfriend, asking her to check and make sure that all of the family's weapons were safely stored away and accounted for. When Daniel's girlfriend Debbie checked the safe, she confirmed everything was in order and nothing was missing. This did a lot to calm the nerves of Rhonda, but in a sense, it also made things worse, because this meant that she was back to square one. This is when Jeremy decided that it was time to speak with Brad's mother personally. Jeremy called Rhonda shortly thereafter and explained everything that had transpired that day. Now, we don't know all the specifics of their call, but Jeremy said that he'd last seen Brad when he left and rode off on the bike that he borrowed from his neighbor. He added that Brad wasn't in the best of moods when he left that day. Jeremy was able to confirm that, as far as he knew, he had been the last person to have seen Brad, but he also added that in the last conversation that he had with Brad had allegedly claimed that his life, quote, sucked, shortly before pedaling off on his bike. But by the following Monday, when Brad still had not been located, and rumors were beginning to grow far more frequent and far more concerning, the school decided that it was time to get involved. This is when Anne Schelling stepped in. Anne was one of the school's lead administrators, and she spoke with Jeremy twice that day, as well as dozens of other students who had some sort of relation to Brad. Now, according to Anne, she was able to determine that Jeremy, Brad, and Taylor, the female friend who had stopped by, had all been hanging out that day. Now, prior to this, it doesn't seem as though Jeremy had ever mentioned that Taylor had been at the house that day. It seems that this information was first brought up when Anne had spoken with Taylor privately. For whatever reason, Jeremy was doing his best to keep Taylor out of the situation. But now, things had escalated. Anne decided to bring both Taylor and Jeremy into the room at the same time, and that's when Jeremy adapted his story slightly, saying that the two had last seen Brad heading off on his bike, with Brad claiming that he would return in about 10 minutes, but he never came back. This is where things get incredibly interesting, and the story that Jeremy shared with his parents and investigators, well, it began to fall apart. Jeremy knew something about where Brad had gone, but he wasn't willing to let this information slip. Realizing that Taylor and Jeremy had each been telling completely different versions of the story, Anne decided to pull Taylor aside and ask her what had really happened that day. Taylor was incredibly honest, even when she realized that her confession may get Jeremy in a lot of trouble. Taylor admitted that she had made plans with the boys to meet up at Jeremy's house that day. She added that when she arrived, she noticed Brad's bike in the driveway, a fact that didn't align with the story that Jeremy had shared, claiming Brad had already driven off on his bike. But strangely, when she entered the home, Brad was nowhere to be found. She noticed Brad's backpack sitting on the kitchen table alongside his pager, yet Brad wasn't inside the house. When Taylor asked Jeremy where Brad was, Jeremy explained that Brad had left. Taylor obviously didn't believe him. All of his things had been left behind, so where had Brad gone, and why would he leave all of his stuff? Taylor felt that Jeremy was playing some sort of a joke and believed Brad must have been hiding somewhere in the house. But after wandering all throughout the house and calling Brad's name and getting no response, Taylor finally began to believe that Jeremy was telling the truth. But no sooner than she believed him, she began to doubt him once more. That's because, as she wandered into the laundry room, she found Brad's shoes covered in red stains. After finding Brad's shoes, Taylor continued looking around the room and noticed that Brad's t-shirt was in the washing machine. It too had been stained red. But the most concerning detail was that there was a small hole in the front of the shirt. Immediately after, Taylor found a few red drips in the kitchen. When she asked Jeremy what had happened, he explained that he and Brad had gotten into an argument about her. One of the boys had called her a name, and the other boy took issue with that. A fight ensued, and Brad eventually hit Jeremy with a bar stool, causing the hole in his shirt, the red stains, and the spots on the floor. But Jeremy clearly didn't have any wounds on his body. But then Taylor noticed a small hole in the kitchen wall. Jeremy claimed that Brad had grabbed one of the weapons from Jeremy's stepfather's cabinet and fired a single shot. Thankfully, it missed Jeremy, but it left a hole in the wall. Shortly after this is when Brad ran out of the home, claiming that he would be back soon. After Taylor revealed all of this, Anne decided to bring Jeremy back into the room. She asked him about various aspects of Taylor's story, and he finally admitted to nearly all of them. But when she asked about the hole in the kitchen wall, as well as the weapon being fired that day, he denied all of it. Jeremy claimed it was nothing more than a rumor. When Anne reached out to Daniel, Jeremy's stepfather, he stood by his son's claims and insisted that no weapons were used that day, nor was there a hole in the kitchen wall. Police would speak with Jeremy a few weeks later at his school, and Jeremy would alter his story once again, this time claiming that Brad had attacked him with a butter knife before leaving the home and never coming back. Jeremy also added that he believed Brad had run away to Arizona with a man named Poppy, or that he had run away to California to find his dad. He wasn't entirely sure. But the following month, December 15th, Daniel reached out to two detectives who were working Brad's case and asked to speak with them. He explained that Jeremy had finally admitted that he and Brad were playing with a weapon on the day that Brad went missing. He claims that Jeremy came clean and admitted that a single shot had been fired that day. Jeremy even dug the slug out of the kitchen wall and held onto it all this time, with Daniel turning the slug over to investigators for further research. But my question is, if all of this is true, how had Daniel not noticed the hole in the wall until now? When detectives later showed up at the family's home, they asked Jeremy to reenact what had transpired the day that Brad vanished, and he claimed that the two got into an argument and Brad grabbed a weapon, firing a single round at it, which narrowly missed his shoulder. But when detectives took note of the location where Jeremy claimed all of this transpired, they realized how low the hole in the wall was, and there was no way that the slug could have narrowly missed Jeremy's shoulder. It would have gone right through him. When Jeremy was confronted with this evidence, it's reported that he slumped down a bit lower so that the hole in the wall would align more closely with his shoulder. Detectives then realized that there was something fishy going on here. About 3 weeks went by, and this now brings us to January of 1996. The detectives who were working the case had thought long and hard about the situation, and they no longer believed that Brad had run away. They felt that there was much more to this story than Jeremy was willing to admit. They didn't know if Jeremy was guilty of something, or if he was just covering up for his best friend, but they knew something was off. Based purely on a gut feeling, they decided to seize the family's trash can, bringing it in for forensic testing. Now, I've heard one version of the story that claims that the detectives were tipped off by local trash collectors, but other resources claim that the detectives seized the can purely off a gut feeling. I'm not sure which version of events is true, but admittedly it's largely irrelevant to the case. When detectives gained possession of the can, though, they noticed a brown pool in the bottom, as well as some brown drippage on the outside. According to detectives, they believed there was a small chance that this dried liquid may have belonged to Brad. Unfortunately, when samples were taken and compared with Brad's mother, there was a direct link between the two, meaning that whoever the evidence belonged to, they were a direct relative of Rhonda. Around this same time, Jeremy and his mother decided to uproot and move to Las Vegas. The two never explained why they had decided to do this, especially in the middle of an active investigation. But thankfully, police were able to make the proper connections with Arizona police, and they maintained contact with Jeremy, and thankfully so, because in February of 1996, about 4 months after the disappearance of Brad, Jeremy decided that enough was enough. He finally opened up with detectives and confessed what had really taken place that November day. When Jeremy arrived at the police station, he quickly confessed that he and Brad had, in fact, been playing with weapons on the day that Brad was last seen. He says that they'd been playing with multiple weapons when he aimed one at Brad. When he did, he bumped his hand on something, causing him to flinch, and the weapon went off without him ever having his finger on the trigger. The slug struck Brad, but he was still alive. But what's crazy is that Jeremy had begun to panic and clean up the crime scene, leaving Brad there, desperate for help. Jeremy dug the slug out of the wall and tossed it into the trash, along with several cigarette butts that the two had been smoking earlier that day. Now, Jeremy's version of events is incredibly graphic, but based on what he told detectives, Jeremy insists that the whole situation was an accident. He claims the weapon wasn't even cocked when it went off, but this is completely impossible. According to experts, there's a distinct possibility that Brad was alive for an entire hour after the shot had rung out, meaning there was more than enough time for him to have been saved. Yet, because Jeremy panicked, Brad lost his life due to sheer negligence. We don't know if Jeremy was afraid that his parents would find out that they've been playing with weapons, or if he was afraid that he may go to prison. This has never been fully explained. But regardless, Jeremy was too busy cleaning up the scene of the crime and covering up his own mistakes to have taken the time to actually help his best friend survive what was apparently an honest mistake. In the end, Jeremy claims that he hauled Bradley out to the family trash bin and tossed him inside. Bradley would remain in the trash bin for an entire week before trash collectors even dumped the bin. Now, we don't know how they didn't discover Brad's remains inside, but somehow they didn't. In the end, Jeremy was arrested and charged in the second degree. Investigators believe there is zero chance that the weapon went off that day accidentally. After inspecting the weapon, detectives say that there's no possibility a simple bump could have caused the weapon to have been discharged. They believe that the trigger was pulled with intent, even if the demise of Bradley was truly just a mistake. Though many people, including investigators, refuse to believe that this was a mistake at all. The sheer fact that Jeremy went to such great lengths to conceal his wrongdoing suggests there may have been far more to this case than Jeremy is willing to admit. After all was said and done, Jeremy was convicted and sent to prison for 22 years after being tried as an adult, despite only being 13 when the crime was committed. He entered prison in January of 1998 and was set to be released back in December of 2021, meaning he's now a free man. But the main thing about this case that I just can't wrap my head around is, what about Jeremy's parents? Now, I'm not accusing them of anything, that's certainly not my intention, but how could all of this have unfolded without them realizing anything? After all, Jeremy's stepfather, Daniel, claims to have inspected the weapon and even smelled it, yet claimed it had never been fired. He also claimed that all of his ammunition was accounted for, but it couldn't have been, because one round had clearly been fired. He also claims that all of his weapons were locked away in the family's safe. So does that mean Jeremy had a key or a code to the safe? It's certainly possible that he stole the key from his father without him knowing, but that still doesn't explain how his father claimed there was no hole in the kitchen wall when there certainly was. It also doesn't explain how, when Daniel reached out to investigators shortly after the crime, he opened up to them and explained that Jeremy had admitted a weapon had been discharged that day. He even handed him the slug that had allegedly come out of the wall. But this couldn't have been the one that ended Brad's life, because we know that Jeremy had already thrown that one away. So this would mean that a total of 2 rounds had been fired from this weapon, yet Daniel didn't notice the missing ammunition. But if all of this weren't enough, what about the trash bin? Did no one ever take the trash out in the 4 months since Brad had vanished? Surely one of Jeremy's parents would have noticed all the liquid that was in the bottom of the can and dripping down the sides on the outside of the can. Surely someone would have noticed a boy in the bottom of the bin for that first week. Worse yet, surely someone would have smelled something. Now, like I said, I can't with a clear conscience accuse Jeremy's parents of anything, but the whole situation just feels suspicious to me. I hate this so much for Rhonda and the rest of Brad's family. So much more could have been done to save this boy. I even hate it for Jeremy too, because if this was some sort of simple accident or mistake, Jeremy's own panic caused him to lose his best friend and be sent to prison for 22 years, when all of this could have been avoided with a simple phone call for an ambulance. This whole case is just tragic from beginning to end. I just hope that Rhonda was able to make peace with things, even though there's nothing in the world that could bring back her little boy.